Thank you, Paul. Good morning. Kuhn, Paul, thanks very much for the introduction. Thanks to all of you for being here. How about the traffic out there? That was pretty special this morning, huh? It's a pleasure to join with you this morning here in Mons for NIAS 2015. You know, the next few days are going to afford you an opportunity to talk about innovation, technical solutions, collaborative opportunities, procurement, communications, comm, ISR, and even more than that. I watched this morning as you entered this plenary. This is a great crowd. It's Tuesday morning and we're beginning an important event right now. Look around. In this hall, there are technical experts. There's folks that know everything you want to know about computers and electronics, networking. There's some of you that are specializing in reconnaissance and ISR. You can meet up with academics and government employees and even senior policymakers to share your insights, your ideas, where you think this ought to go. And maybe best of all, a few minutes ago I toured the booths, and I can tell you there are some great products, there's some innovative ideas out there, and there's a lot of cutting edge out there among the 90 vendors this morning. So you have a lot to look forward to in the next 3 days. You may not recognize why it's such an honor for me to join you in a lead speaking position at a meeting like this. You see, it seems unlikely to me that you would invite a dinosaur-like C-130 navigator that grew up in the age of sextants and celestial navigation to speak at a cutting-edge forum like this to technology leaders and defense experts. I still remember my first convention in 1973 in Houston, Texas. I sat out in the audience, as you are, and I looked up at the podium, and I really was highly impressed by the gentleman who rather skillfully delivered a keynote address to about 1,000 people. And I remember thinking to myself that I could never do that, and it's still amazing to me that I get a chance to do it here this morning. You might know that I grew up in a pre-computer, analog age, and I taught myself how to program and use a Commodore 64. Anybody have one of those? Come on, own up if you had a Commodore 64. I'm going to ask you a couple times throughout my presentation to own up to a few things. So we started out on those Commodores, Tandys, or an early Apple machine. In my case, I was a flyer, but later I actually got the chance to be the first director of cyber operations in the United States Air Force. That's some interesting career progression for me. Do any of you remember, and I know that some of you are old enough to remember, looking at Dick Tracy cartoons in the newspaper? A show of hands, please. Dick Tracy cartoons. And what did Dick Tracy have on his left arm? It was a watch that he could talk, make phone calls, communicate through. And that was something 40 years ago that we couldn't imagine actually happening in our lifetime. It was sort of magical. I wonder this morning, how many of you are wearing some item that's IT connected and allows you to communicate? Maybe an Apple Watch. How many of those are in here? How many of you are wearing an IT communication device on somewhere on your body? I think there's more of you that are holding back. We've made some tremendous progress in 30 or 40 years, and the speed of change and development just seems to continue. The rate at that things become obsolete seems to be shorter and shorter, and it seems to me that Moore's Law has become just shorthand for the speed of innovation in the world these days. So I actually didn't come to talk to you about cyber. I came to talk to you about what's going on outside. As you begin this conference, let me offer you this insight. It'd be really cool to have walked in here and just closed the doors and forget about what's going on outside of this convention center and just talk about cool things like comm and cyber. It would be nice to do that, but we can't do that. So I used to be a J5, a strategic planner. I spent most of my senior adult life doing that work in the government. In that job, what I did was tried to help people recognize the things that could happen in the future, could happen, and where in the world they might happen. And I and others in that field used to talk about an arc of instability, sort of stretching from the Middle East through North Africa, the arc of instability. You've heard that term. And you know what? All that stuff that we used to predict could happen is happening. It's all happening. The Arab Spring didn't bring us more security or more democracy. It gave rise to all kinds of new turmoil, thousands of refugees, an increasing extremist threat across the Middle East and North Africa. I used to talk about the south to north migration like it was a school lesson. In both hemispheres, the migration is from south to north, and it's really not about the movement of the people that's concerning. It's not about the direction. The concerning part is who are the people, why are they coming, what are they bringing, and as you notice now, it's become perfectly clear in the last month or so, the incredible amount of risk that people are willing to take to move from one continent to another. In this case, here in Europe, we're painfully aware of the amount of difficulty and danger that people are willing to face to get to here. And then how Europe deals with that, the pressure that's on European governments right now as migrants press on their borders, seeking their services, their help, and as politicians and governments try to decide how to divide those immigrants among many capable countries. You know, developing nations always have a higher birth rate than more established nations. So as people move to other regions, their children in coming generations will outnumber the locals. But assimilation in society happens at different rates in every different country and area. Another unfortunate reality is that the routes that people travel to get to places are the same routes that are used for every other kind of movement, whether it's trafficking drugs or money or people. That's the way, and the same people, some of them not very scrupulous, are the same people doing those movements. So don't also forget the fact that foreign fighters can travel in and amongst that same group of people. And now you have all the ingredients you need for a severe crisis in the European region. Nations on the southern flank today are overwhelmed by the migrant flow. And now we find that Central European countries are equally overwhelmed by the arrival rate of migrants in their cities. The EU and the NATO nations are under fire for how they've handled the influx so far, and they're rapidly trying to resolve that. In the east, Russia has used all forms of activity to destabilize the Donbas region of Ukraine after illegally annexing Crimea. Hybrid warfare, well, you know what? It mixes seamlessly with hybrid peace. It's really hard to tell the difference. Deniability is the key to most of the Russian activities in the Ukraine. Several European nations have recently endured periods of severe austerity, and others teeter on the brink of bankruptcy. Meanwhile, China expands its hegemony in the South China Sea by actually building new islands and calling them Chinese islands. That's hugely destabilizing in the region. So let me go back to that tame combination of words called the arc of instability and say that it's been replaced in 2015 by actually a world that's in chaos and crisis. Chaos and crisis. So, folks, I'm not somebody to use hyperbole, and I'm not a person to go out and try and scare you. But I would just tell you, in September of 2015, we have to be honest with ourselves, and that is to say that the global trend lines are almost all going in the wrong direction. And so, while all that's going on in the background, what's going on in cyberspace? Well, in the last few months, we've seen some of the most aggressive hacking and cyber hostage taking and ransom demands in a series that we've seen in a long time. At the same time, the Internet of Things grows exponentially. I think by 2020, there'll be about 25 billion items connected to the Internet of Things. You know, bank robbers no longer carry guns. They just stay home in their pajamas. They work on their computer. They look for account numbers, PINs, and passwords, put all that together, and every once in a while they get paid with stolen credentials. Target, Home Depot, JP Morgan, Sony, TV5 in France, your government and mine have all been hacked lately. Detailed plans for rocket motors, jet aircraft, nuclear power plants, security, electronic control systems, computer networks, they're all stolen and copied across the internet by hackers. You should also know that 80% of jihadists are now recruited and radicalized over the internet, usually in their own home. They can learn violent techniques and they can become fully inspired to action without ever leaving their home. I read something this weekend that said there were about 500, just over 500 serious data breaches this year alone in 2015. You know, cyberspace is actually apolitical and it's amoral. It doesn't have a good or bad aspect, but it can be used for good and for bad purposes. If you represent a company or you protect a company, you probably ought to be aware of all that and make sure your company doesn't underestimate the risks that are out there. So with all that as a setup, what should we do? What should we do about all that? Number one, Mr. Geisber already spoke about the fact that we need to work together. The cyber domain is the ultimate partnership domain. 90% of the systems actually reside in the private sector. So if you're from government and you have the idea that you need to direct or determine how things work out, then your sight picture is all wrong. It's actually industry, private companies, governments, NGOs, universities. We all need to work together so that we can figure out how to trust each other. And I think trust has to go to a whole new level. You know, top-down directing and demanding, especially when it comes from a government, is going to fail. What we have to have is really good situational awareness. What's going on out there, and share that with each other. It seems that most of the public forum websites that I look at, the headlines, the discussions, they all seem to focus on malware. And actually, that's not where I think the focus belongs. If you've done forensics on a computer attack, you always get to this question. How did the malware get there? Who's clicking on it, and why? The cyber adversary is always adapting, always changing. They're always looking for the next opportunity, so our training and our practices have to constantly be in change. Number two, if you're a leader and you're here, I would say to you that it's not good enough for you to have a smart team of techies with you. If you're a president or on a board of directors, if you're a manager or a team leader, you have to personally understand what the inherent risks of cyberspace are. You have to involve yourself directly in what the threats are and what we're doing about them. I've always told organizational leaders that they must know not just the name, but the person who administers their network. They have to know them and they have to trust them. I'm going to offer to you that the Secretary General of NATO needs to know Kuhn Geisber and know that he trusts him, because NATO's network security is absolutely dependent on the decisions that that man makes. Would you blindly turn your financial portfolio over to a complete stranger? I don't think so. But too often, businesses and organizations are willing to do that with their networks and never give it a second thought. The cyber domain is all about shared risk and shared vulnerabilities. I really wanted to tell you this morning that the cyber domain is different from the other domains, but actually, if you study it, you quickly come to the conclusion that they actually have a lot more in common than they have in separation or in difference. So commercial ships sail on the same ocean with military vessels and pleasure crafts. They all encounter the same threats. I can say the same about commercial airplanes in the air domain, and I can say the same about commercial satellites that fly in space. Cyber actually isn't that different in that regard. What is different is what the investment opportunity is today and in the future. We should be looking for shared models of investment between the public and the private sectors. That's where partnership will drive the best deals. And even as we look and spend time trying to figure out what we can learn together and how to share that information, we need to be carefully thinking about how to buy those solutions. And let me just say that the way the government has bought everything else, our acquisition processes for buying aircraft carriers and bombers, they won't apply to cyber because you need the answer, the solution today, and you have to have an acquisition system that allows you to put money against a solution overnight, or you're going to be late to need. So let me conclude with just a couple of recommendations about how it looks to me from NATO and what I think industry and nations could do together. So NATO is an alliance of 28 nations with about 30 or more partners. We're operating around the globe. We have some unique cyber and ISR challenges. And when we talk about ISR, number one, I just encourage you to realize we're talking about a whole platform, a whole group of systems, not just one. We're talking about an interconnected group of capability that's a lot more than just one or two systems that people sometimes mean when they say JISR in NATO. I already said it, but since we're all dependent on IP-based computers and networks, it's essential that we work together. In the alliance, we're going to have to work to reinforce our member and partner networks because our network is only as good as our weakest partner that we allow to plug in. You know, non-state adversaries don't follow the rules, so we're going to have to find ways to beat them even if they don't follow the rules. And I think lastly, let me offer you this. If you or we have a public-facing portal, social media included, it has to work. It has to be credible because that's our organization's credibility that's on the line when it doesn't. So let me say thanks this morning for listening to me, and let me introduce to you this world and cyberspace to the conversations that you're going to have later while you're here in the next 3 days. I've shared some perspectives on the man-made, partnership-driven cyber domain. I very much look forward to taking a couple of questions and then to you hearing from a whole host of excellent speakers later today and tomorrow. Thanks very much. I appreciate it. Thanks, Paul.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the General said, he'll take a few questions. My colleague Conrad has a microphone, and if you wish to ask a question, he'll come to you and you can then ask away. Any questions, please? Who's going to ask the first question? I thought someone's got their hand up over there.
Good morning, General. Ian West, Chief Cyber Security. We often hear about what should the EU do and what should NATO do from a global perspective in cybersecurity. What are your views on NATO's role, perhaps in a more global sense?
Thanks. Great question. I think what I'll do is take that and tell you that what NATO and EU should do is exactly what I just described to you. That's collaborate. There's a whole bunch of areas where EU and NATO have slightly different angles of approach on the same problem. This is one of those. Our responsibility in NATO, because we tend to be an alliance who is very active militarily in supporting operations and setting up and planning, we have to look at it from that angle and make sure we're prepared to do that. The EU has a larger governmental role, but the opportunity to collaborate and for information to improve the quality of networks and cyber protection across the EU and therefore across the world is huge. I think we're in an early stage of that, and I would tell you that in my experience, I've had no contact with anybody in the EU to talk about that. Not my responsibility, I'm not that guy, but that would tell me something because I do talk to them about a lot of other things. So I think the opportunity is wide open. I think the responsibility and the interest is slightly different, but the benefit will be to all of us the more we do exactly that, which is work together. Exactly. Don't be shy, please.
Any more questions? Shy audience. General,
Okay.
thank you very much indeed
Thank you, Paul.
for opening this NIAS conference
I
this morning.
appreciate it.
And ladies and gentlemen,
Thank you. Thanks so much.